I know it's wildfires outside, smoke, and the pandemic, and so I appreciate you devoting this hour to hear a little bit about my research on planning for extreme heat. You may hear my kids in the background. I'm not actually, this is a virtual background. I'm not actually at the University of Arizona, so I'm home with the kids running around, trying to be well behaved right now. So, but yes, my name is Lad Keith, and I'm an assistant professor in planning at the University of Arizona. And like Karen mentioned, I'm a local Tucsonan, and I've been involved in planning here for quite a while on things like our sustainability plan. But my research area is specifically, like she mentioned, on kind of that intersection between urban planning and climate information and climate change. And so some of this may be background. I know you've had a couple of other speakers on extreme heat, so I'll go through this part fairly quickly and then get to some of my research findings and what we've been working on. But extreme heat's obviously relevant in increasing climate risk. And I'd say out of all of the climate risks that cities have been planning for, this is probably the up and coming one for many reasons, but it's one that's just coming to kind of the public forefront over sea level rise, which has been kind of in public awareness for much longer, things like wildfire and stuff too. So Tucson's the third fastest warming city in the United States. And we've experienced our second hottest summer on record last year. We'll probably break that again this year. I'm sure the other speakers that you've heard from the summer spoke about the climatology side of that too. And we've kind of had continual summers where we keep ranking in the top 10 hottest. But outside of just Tucson, I'm concerned about heat across the whole country and across the whole globe. So for cities across the globe, it's definitely an issue. And this is an image from the National Weather Service last year. And we had a heat wave that impacted 2/3 of the United States. And you can see that 128 million people were under excessive heat warnings. So it's not just a Tucson, Phoenix problem anymore. We're seeing across the whole United States, people dealing with these extreme temperatures that they haven't necessarily dealt with before. To talk a little bit about some of the impacts. So I'm sure some of the other speakers have talked about the public health concerns with extreme heat. Those are the ones that usually come to the front of your mind, maybe. So heat is actually the #1 weather-related killer in the United States, and we have thousands of deaths attributed to extreme heat every year. But beyond just the mortality from extreme heat, we want to think about all of the documented and undocumented cases of people going to the doctor or going to the hospital or emergency room from extreme heat exposure. And so it's absolutely a social equity issue because those most impacted are those that are probably not like many of us that are on this Zoom right now, but they might not have air conditioning in their housing. They're outdoor workers. They are folks that have to take public transportation or have to walk to work. And during those heat waves, they don't have the choice necessarily to kind of hide inside their homes like the rest of us are able to with air conditioning. And so it's absolutely a equity issue. Beyond just the health concerns, though, we want to think about quality of life. And many of us, if you've lived in Tucson for quite a while, we already have adapted to heat. And so you maybe walk your dogs earlier or later in the day in the summer, or you skip walking them at all if it's a week like this where it's into the 108s. But kind of thinking of the quality of life and what that does, not to yourself and your pets, but if you have kids, are they able to go out and play in parks? Or do we have to kind of keep them, keep them inside this whole time? And so I'm kind of thinking about the quality of life issues for cities and, that impacts the attractiveness of cities to attract new residents and be economically competitive too. So there's a lot of planning considerations with that. There's a lot of economic concerns with extreme heat, and we're learning more about these, but research has documented that we've lost billions of labor hours each year due to extreme heat. And so as the planet continues to get hotter, there's absolutely an economic impact on the labor market. And so again, you can imagine agricultural workers or outdoor construction workers being impacted, but also retail tends to drop during extreme heat waves. And they've also shown that economic productivity of kind of even just financial services can tend to drop too during these heat wave periods. And so there's definitely an economic concern too. Energy and water usage tends to go up, obviously. And so, when it's hotter, you water your plants more. We have to water agriculture a lot more. That has a huge impact. And we use a lot more energy to keep our buildings cooler. And again, you can think of your own residence, but then think of all those commercial buildings like a Walmart or a public library that has to expend a lot more air conditioning to keep those buildings cool. Infrastructure and urban systems are impacted quite a bit. And so you can think of the dramatic examples of maybe like the Phoenix airport, where the planes literally can't take off because they're not engineered to take off after certain temperatures. So that's a pretty dramatic example of kind of infrastructure failing after a heat wave, but kind of less exciting, but more interesting to me maybe. The way that we design our bus stops is absolutely a major investment of public money, or the way that we design our light rail system in Tucson and do those stops that we put millions of dollars into really shade people very well. If you've used the light rail system, if they don't do a really good job shading people. And so kind of thinking of all of that public investment along those transportation corridors particularly, and are they being set up to serve our population well for the next 10 or 20 years as temperatures continue to rise? Ecology and landscapes is a big one too. And so as temperatures increase, we put more strain on our urban ecology. And so all of those landscapes that we plant and maintain and spend money on, they tend to do much less well when it's hotter. And we may even be moving into different temperature thresholds. And so that's something that researchers are looking at, where the plants that are on our plant list for many places like the city of Tucson are based off of historic information and what's thrived here in the past. But those plants aren't necessarily the plants that will do well in 10 or 20 years. And so if it's an annual flower or a little shrub that you replace every 5 years, it's probably not that big of a deal. But if you're looking at something like major investments in trees, we have to make sure the trees that we're planting, that we're expecting to live for a decade or longer, are the right types of trees that will live in these environments of the future. And so that's not just in Tucson, but you can imagine places across the country and across the globe having to think of these issues. And then the last issue that I mentioned is sustainable development efforts. And so one of the big goals of urban planning right now is to get people out of their cars and to make cities more walkable and dense and kind of increase mixed use. And many of you know, I recognize lots of names on this Zoom. Many of you know that these are all things that increase our sustainability and drive down greenhouse gas emissions. So that's nothing new to many of you. But kind of imagine all of those goals that we're putting into plans like Plan Tucson or climate action plans, and they're all being counteracted by increasing temperatures, because you might be able to build a more walkable sidewalk in a more walkable neighborhood, but if the temperatures are 10 degrees hotter, that's going to encourage people to not go outside and not to use those sidewalks and kind of push them back into maybe their personal automobiles. And so a lot of the goals that we have for cities of the future are being directly counteracted by increasing temperatures. So we want to kind of take a look at that too. So I'm sure you guys have seen graphs like this too, because you're a climate group. But obviously one giant contributor to extreme heat is climate change. And usually when I do these talks, I spend a lot more time on this, but I think this is a fairly climate friendly group. And so I'm going through really quickly. Climate change is leading to an increase in global average temperatures, of course. And for extreme heat planning, we think of that in an increase in frequency and duration of extreme heat waves. So they're happening more often, and when they do happen, they're happening longer too. And for public health, a giant consideration is that we're unfortunately seeing faster increases in nighttime temperatures. And looking at the public health side, you really need those nighttime temperatures to be cool, because that's when your body has a chance to kind of refresh itself. And we really see negative consequences to public health when those heat waves drive those temperatures up for 2 or 3 or 4 days in a row. And again, that might not impact you if you have an air conditioning system in your house, but for those houses that are substandard, or for those folks that can't afford the electricity for air conditioning, they're really at risk during those heat waves, especially when those nighttime temperatures keep increasing. And you can see in the graph on the right-hand side of the screen that just a small increase in the average global temperature can really throw us into new climate thresholds, where we're kind of dealing with new extreme hot weather that we've never dealt with before. And so I think it was just 2 days ago that Siberia actually recorded 100 degrees. And that's something that they hadn't thought would happen until 2100 even. So again, this isn't just a Tucson problem, but we're seeing it kind of across the globe. And so just to kind of drive the point home, so again, in one of the previous slides, I said 128 million people were under a heat warning in the United States last summer. But there's a heat wave in Europe last summer that affected 321 million people. And then in India, where quite a large portion of the population doesn't have access to air conditioning, they had a heat wave that affected 890 million people. So again, just kind of driving the point home that this is a global issue. And I think actually being in Tucson, we have a lot to offer the rest of the world because we've dealt with hot temperatures before. So again, there's a lot of these places, India has dealt with extreme heat before, but as a lot of these other places that haven't necessarily dealt with it move into these new thresholds, they're absolutely looking at desert cities to kind of see what we've done in the past. So another contributor to extreme heat is the urban heat island effect, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with this too. And the UHI is basically the idea that the way that we plan and design our built environment makes it hotter in the city than it would be in the natural or surrounding countrysides. And so there's lots of contributors to this. It's a really complex phenomenon, but it includes land use and cover change. So obviously more built materials is going to increase the temperature. The way that we shape the built environment though through urban forms, so things like building height, density, and arrangements, all of those things impact the urban heat island too. The type of building materials that we use and how reflective or how light they are impacts the urban heat island. So darker materials is obviously going to capture more heat and release it at night than lighter materials. And the amount of vegetation and humidity has a big impact on it too. As you can see on the graph on the right, there's nothing too surprising probably about that. The more urban areas are hotter than the surrounding areas. The one thing that's kind of interesting is that the pond, which is kind of towards the left-hand side, has a lower daytime temperature because during the day it has evapotranspiration where it's basically kind of cooling off the air around it. But at nighttime, it actually releases all of that heat. And so some of my colleagues in Phoenix have done research where they show if you have a swimming pool in your backyard, it can create a cooler backyard experience during the day, but at night it can actually raise the temperature enough to kick on your air conditioning more than it would be naturally. And so there's lots of complexities with urban heat island kind of at the site scale, but then also if you think of this as a pond or a swimming pool, but you can think of a whole river. And so depending on the geography and the climate of a place, it can really impact the UHI in what you see. Another category is waste heat emissions. So of course, air conditioning creates heat on the outside while it's cooling off the inside. And things even like running a car kind of contributes to the overall UHI too. And then air pollution acts as a trapper of heat. And so when we see things like the wildfire that's going on right now, or kind of like the worst pollution days when we get those warnings, those will tend to trap into heat also. So we have like a mini greenhouse effect happening in our cities when that occurs. Let's see here. I think the one other thing I'll mention here is UHI is, I'll mention this on the next slide too, but UHI is a good way to kind of think through the urban heat phenomenon, but you wouldn't want to look at this graph and automatically conclude that downtowns are bad because they tend to be in the center of a regional area that also tends to be where the UHI is the worst. The reason I say that is because they've done research that shows that sprawling cities that have a very low density downtown also have a significant UHI effect. And so it's not just the specific places that are dense, it's the basically the agglomeration of the whole region. So even sprawling neighborhoods with lots of lawns contribute to the overall UHI. So you don't want to take this and say downtown's bad, suburbs good, because actually like sprawling metropolitan areas with massive kind of low density residential can contribute as much to UHI as like a dense downtown. So that's something to kind of be aware of. So UHI can result in differences between the urban and rural areas as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And in places like Phoenix, where it's particularly bad, it can be as much as 22 degrees on the hottest days. And that's something I'm sure everyone here has experienced if you drive, you know, through a hot area and kind of go out to a rural countryside, it's going to feel noticeably cooler. Or if you walk, again, if you walk at night, you might feel cooler as you go into a wash area or go by a park or something. One other thing to keep in mind is that UHI is only one of the imperfect ways that we use to kind of understand urban heat and extreme heat. And so this map is something that we created for Avondale, Arizona, which is on the west side of the Phoenix metropolitan region. And it shows the red is the hotter areas and the blue is the cooler areas. And so this is kind of a typical UHI map. The blue areas are mostly actually agricultural fields. So again, it's that trade-off. It's using precious like groundwater sources for agricultural purposes. But we don't want to conclude by this that we want to irrigate everything and have like unnatural water sources, right? And you can see that kind of towards the middle of Avondale, in the middle of the map, it's that yellow kind of red color. And so that's actually also the color as the desert on the outside. So it can be really complex, especially in places like in the desert where sometimes we actually have a cooler inside of the city than the outside, because if the desert on the outside is sparsely vegetated, it can actually be hotter than the city, which we unnaturally kind of irrigate with groundwater, if that makes sense. So I can answer more questions about that later, but a typical UHI map that you've probably seen in the past would be more like New York City or Atlanta, where it's surrounded by forests and kind of agriculture. So in the desert, we have a little bit of a more complex relationship with it. So I'll jump to a paper that is currently under review, but basically kind of switching modes and thinking about how planners are dealing with urban heat. Um, so just to start off, the American Planning Association is the professional group that works with planners across the country. And they did a study that showed that 70% of planners in the United States are worried about extreme heat. So that's a really high number. And heat ranked fourth out of 14 hazards. And those included things like wildfires, flooding, sea level rise, earthquakes, all of that. So it was the fourth hazard that planners were concerned about. One reason planners are so concerned about heat is not only that it's increasing, but there's a lack of resources for it. And so one of my colleagues did a study of 3,500 climate adaptation resources and found that only 4% of those focused specifically on heat. And so it's obviously something that planners are worried about, but there's just not a lot of resources out there right now for them to go to and get information on. So to kind of figure out more about where the current state of planning is for heat planning research, we did a systematic literature review and basically looked through Scopus, which is a academic journal repository. And we pulled up all the papers that had extreme heat, urban heat, and planning in the title, abstract, or keywords. And so we used that to generate our list of papers that we went through. And we found 589 papers that had those terms in it. But as you can see here, 60% of those papers have been written in the last 5 years. So again, going back to the last slide, only 4% of climate adaptation resources include information on heat. And this kind of explains why. It's because most of the research on heat has really been done in the last couple of years. And so it's a topic that's kind of exploded in research just recently. And again, this is planning specific. On the public health side, they've been doing stuff on extreme heat for quite a while. And so that would be the other thing to think through is I'm talking about planners, but on the public health side, they have quite a bit more on extreme heat going past through time. Let's see, next slide here. And then just to kind of look at the geography of where this heat planning research is happening, not surprising that China and the United States have the most research because like any topic that you would look at, China and the United States publish the most papers out of everything. So that's not surprising at all. But I think it is interesting to note that Australia is kind of a leader in extreme heat research. And it's because a lot of their cities deal with these extreme heat temperatures. And so it's something that they've been really focused on in research and practice too. And I would say the only thing that concerns me about this kind of outlier of countries looking at heat planning research is that we don't see a lot of the global south represented. And so India is kind of in the middle and has a small little notch, but there's not a lot, there's nothing from Africa. South America is only barely represented by Brazil. And so kind of thinking again of those places where people don't have access to air conditioning, we really need to figure out how to assist the global south with dealing with extreme heat too. Because right now, most of the research happening is in Europe, China, and the United States. And then we looked at, again, out of those 589 papers, where that research, what that research was focusing on. And so 68% of that research was focusing on modeling. And so that's what we kind of categorize that urban heat island mapping or modeling stuff. And so a lot of the research is on how to understand UHI and how to map it and model it in specific cities. 14% of the research was on specific design interventions that cities can use. And then only 7% of it was on planning processes. And again, that's the one that we were most interested in because the mapping and the modeling is important and it tells you where it's hotter. But unless you understand how to actually plan for it, you're not going to get a lot implemented. So that's kind of what we were looking most at. 5% of it looked specifically at impacts, and then there was 4% that were other literature reviews that had been done. So from that small percentage that was just on the planning processes, we categorized some themes that we saw. And some of these included institutional challenges and opportunities. So again, I mentioned before, but one thing that's really prevalent in extreme heat research right now is everything's done in silos. And so the planners are over here doing something, the public health researchers are over here doing something, you have the climatologists doing their mapping and modeling over here. And those three groups that are really important to understand extreme heat and deal with it aren't doing a lot of collaboration and talking about it. So that's a really big issue right now. So breaking down those silos, both in research and practice. We talked about, we found that the papers talked a lot about mainstreaming and the need to integrate extreme heat strategies into existing plans. And so a lot of the work being done on extreme heat planning right now happens specifically only in climate action plans. But to actually implement anything in the built environment, it needs to go beyond a climate action plan and it needs to get into a comprehensive plan. It needs to get into land use development regulations. It needs to get into how we plant our plants, our road layouts, all of that type of stuff. So we need to mainstream what we're working on extreme heat across the whole city governance. Another theme was looking at appropriate planning scales versus the tools available. And so basically, again, if we have a regional UHI map that's created by a researcher, what does that help? How does that help maybe a landscape architect looking at a specific site? And so they can look at that UHI map and then they look at the site and they say, so I'm hotter or colder around me, but what do I do with it? And so there's a lot of gaps between what tools research is creating and the tools that practitioners actually need to make use of those tools. Another big thing is the lack of legal structures for heat planning. And my favorite example with this is if you've lived in Tucson for any amount of time, you know that there's certain areas that flood a lot. And we have, even in Tucson, we have FEMA floodplains. And so if you live in those FEMA floodplains, you have higher insurance rates and the county tries to dissuade you or the city tries to dissuade you from building more in those areas. So we have a whole national structure set up for mapping FEMA floodplains and an insurance, a whole insurance scheme created for flooding insurance, but we have nothing even close to that for heat. And so again, we have like we have floodplain managers in most cities in the United States, or at least in most counties. We don't have heat managers or even a heat staff person. And so kind of thinking through the lack of legal structure for heat compared with other hazards that we face. And I'd say even wildfire, you usually have like the wildfire, the hot shot teams, you have the local fire departments that take lead, you have the WUI folks that do the wildland urban interface for planning for wildfires. And so even for wildfires, we have several organizations that are kind of the leads for that, but we don't have anything comparable for heat. And then the last point is acknowledging complexities, competing priorities, and limited resources. And as all of you know, if you're interested in climate, the cities are interested in other things other than climate. And so economic development's always a big one. Right now, I would say look at COVID-19 and the pandemic and all of the other things going on. And so there's always other competing issues, and how do we kind of make sure that climate is considered along with all of these other issues that are coming to the forefront too. We found some information uses and needs. And so we found that most planners were looking at those UHI maps and models, but they were not using climate change projections almost at all. And so again, the UHI map is going to tell you what your heat's like today, and that's an important thing to understand. But if we're not looking for the climate change projections of communities, that's not really telling us where we're going in the future. And so those climate change projections aren't being integrated into planning very well yet. There's also a lack of information on the planning side that let us understand what we do on the planning side that connects to health risks and vulnerabilities. I'll talk more about that later on. We need to do a better job of quantifying the costs and benefits of our heat mitigation strategies. So again, if we have an urban forestry campaign, does the cost of actually implementing that urban forestry campaign pay off as far as like a cost benefit analysis goes? And usually we don't get that type of information. Decision makers lack training for heat planning. And again, if most of the research has been done in the last 5 years, that's not surprising. And then I mentioned this before, but heat research that's being produced is not always necessarily very useful for decision makers. So I'll jump into some of the strategies. There's two big buckets of strategies, and this isn't just in our, this is from our literature review, but this isn't just in our literature review. One of those big categories is risk management, and that is what you could think of like as emergency operations and more the public health side, where they prepare for those heat waves and respond to them when they occur. And there is a big tension in our literature review that we did that we saw as between managing it as an emergency issue versus a chronic social issue. And so you can imagine the emergency issue is we get a giant heat wave that spikes our temperature up to 115 in Tucson for 4 days. And we have like cooling centers opened and lots of response for that. So that's an emergency issue versus heat as a chronic social issue where it's just generally always 100 degrees. And again, there's lots of those people in those substandard housing conditions that can't afford air conditioning. And, you know, it just generally lowers their health outcomes because they're kind of trapped in those conditions. And so there's a tension between those two things, and we don't do a good job planning for either of them. We also need to understand and address the root causes of vulnerability. So again, I'll keep mentioning housing because that's one of the main ones, but you can't improve or you can't increase resilience and decrease vulnerability if a major portion of your lower income residents are just trapped in substandard housing and have no way to upgrade those conditions. And so that's just something to think about. And then on the design of the built environment side, which is more kind of the purview of urban planners, many of the design strategies that research has delved into are very location specific. And so I'll go into what some of those design strategies are in the next couple of slides. But that's a challenge because what works in Tucson doesn't necessarily work well in Phoenix, which doesn't work in New York City. And so that makes it really tricky kind of making universal recommendations for cities. And these two images that I have showed are the Gowanus area in Brooklyn, New York has done a lot of work on extreme heat. And it's just a kind of a Shutterstock image of people being transported in ambulances. But we don't do a good job, again, of connecting that physical form of the built environment to maybe the health outcomes that people are experiencing. And so again, we're not sharing data and we're not talking to each other as much as we should be between those two areas. So I'll go through really quickly some of the planning and design strategies we saw through our literature review as being kind of the most popular for dealing with extreme heat. And then again, this is coming more from the long-term planning and design of the built environment side. So at the biggest scale, urban development patterns have a big role to play. And again, I mentioned the UHI effect. And so a lot of these come from what we understand about the UHI effect. But things like making sure that our urban geometry and density are in line with what we know about heat, and that as we develop new areas, they're not contributing more to heat and they're mitigating it where we can. Ventilation corridors is a really popular thing in places like New York City and Hong Kong. Not as, definitely not as, I guess not as popular or not as relevant in a place like Tucson that's lower density, but in a city like Hong Kong, they've actually taken down large skyscrapers to increase the airflow so that certain areas don't get kind of trapped with hot heat, with that hot air. The location and size of parks and open space is a big one. And so one of the coolest areas in Tucson is Reed Park because it's the greenest area. And again, part of that's because we're irrigating it and we have lots of lawns and kind of grassy spaces in it. But those kind of our choices about where we put those parks and how large they are have a big role to play too. Water features I mentioned is a big one, not so much in the Southwest, but more in Phoenix than Tucson, certainly. And then I would say another one to think about is land conservation. And so again, in those places where you might have forests surrounded the city, those forests actually help cool the city off. And so I think going forward, I'm certainly seeing more planners looking at land conservation, using that as, using heat as one of the reasons to do land conservation. And I would say in the Southwest, we don't have forests around us very often, unless you're in the mountains, but cities like Las Cruces, New Mexico do have agricultural belts that kind of run along the rivers. And so we did some UHI mapping with Las Cruces, New Mexico, and they actually made some new decisions on their land conservation based on the fact that it actually helps cool off the city at nighttime. Because some of those agricultural areas they were looking at developing and they're kind of calculating that benefit that that agricultural area has to cool off the city at nighttime now too. Building design and materials is another big category. And so this picture is of ENR2, which I know some of you are familiar with. So that's a newer building on the University of Arizona campus. And it was designed kind of biomimicry. It was designed after a slot canyon. And so it has lots of cool shaded outdoor spaces. It makes use of giant fans that kind of circulate the air. And it also makes use of water features, not running water features, but kind of the use of evapotranspiration to cool off the outdoor spaces too. And so that's a really good example of how we can design a building on the interior as well as the exterior to help cool off those outdoor spaces. And so the orientation, the shape, the mass, and the use of shade structures can all be stuff that we can do at the site-specific scale. The use of light and reflective surfaces is another big category. And so this picture is from a program, a jobs training program in New York City called Cool Neighborhoods NYC, where they train folks to go out and paint over the roofs with this reflective roof material. And so that can be really effective. And again, especially in those older building stock that absorb a lot of heat, this can help deflect some of that back into the atmosphere. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the trade-offs that are not so good with reflective materials and other uses. But this can be something that we can think of. And if it's not reflective, kind of thinking if at least the materials we're using are lighter colors so they're not absorbing as much heat. Another big one is waste heat reduction. And so I mentioned before, waste heat emissions has a big role to play with UHI. And so luckily, all of these strategies also decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's kind of a double win. But doing smart building controls, making more efficient HVAC systems or air conditioning, using efficient lighting. And then this is a bigger one in large cities, but making sure that that we vent that waste heat away from pedestrians. Because if you've gone through New York City or a lot of those larger cities, a lot of times they just kind of vent all that heat right onto you as you walk by it. And so if we can vent those away from people, the places where people actually use, that's a good thing too. And then the most popular planning and design strategy is urban greening. And so of course that includes urban tree canopy increases, things like green infrastructure that we're honestly a leader for in the United States, not just even the Southwest anymore. Things like green roofs and walls. And I would say those are much more region specific. And so I mentioned before that some of these design strategies work better in some places than others. Green infrastructure is great in Tucson. Green urban tree canopy can be good in Tucson if we do it appropriately and if we have the water source for it. But things like green roofs are like not usually very appropriate in Tucson because the species that thrive in Tucson on places like that are inhospitable like roofs are not usually the ones that give us a lot of benefits for the like the urban cooling or the flood retention. And so in a place like Miami or a place like New York City or Portland, green roofs or walls can be really good options, but not so much here in the Southwest. And I mentioned before, but the idea of future-proofing our landscaping. And so some cities are looking at updating those plant lists again to make them good for the future, good for the next 20 years, and not just based off of what's thrived here in the past. So now some considerations for research and practice, and just keeping an eye on the clock here. So so I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with co-benefits, trade-offs, and maladaptations. And so I'll kind of explain them through the extreme heat planning lens. And so when we're thinking about these planning and design strategies, we want to make sure that we try to get those strategies that have a lot of co-benefits. Co-benefits are the idea that one action you take benefits multiple scales and multiple kind of areas. And so I have a picture here of green infrastructure. So again, green infrastructure, as many of you know, helps reduce urban flooding because it takes that water off the street. It helps increase our urban ecology and kind of natural vegetation. And all of that natural vegetation and increased urban ecology can help decrease the urban heat island effect. And then it also makes the city more beautiful and has kind of a social impact there too. So green infrastructure can have a lot of co-benefits that stack on top of each other, which is a really good thing. Trade-offs can be more like this image is of air conditioners in New York City. And so I've worked with New York City a lot on extreme heat. And one thing that they're looking at doing is for those lower income areas that have substandard housing and apartment buildings, giving them air conditioners as part of a low-income air conditioning assistance program. And so again, that's for a public health benefit. As New York City continues to get hotter, some of these places just aren't habitable unless they have air conditioning anymore. But as they give them air conditioners, you can imagine that those older buildings, the energy use is going to skyrocket, right? And so it's a trade-off because we want to protect those lower income populations that are really vulnerable to extreme heat. But by doing that, we're also increasing our greenhouse gas emissions, which can make the problem worse if we're increasing climate change, right? And so again, New York City is trying to do a good job of also making those older apartment buildings more efficient so that that trade-off is manageable and that it's not increasing greenhouse gas emissions too much. And so that's something that you might say, sure, it has a cost for the greenhouse gas emissions, but because it's a social equity issue, we have to do it because it's just not safe for those populations to not have air conditioning anymore. And then on the maladaptation side, I have a picture here of Los Angeles Street. And so some of you may have heard last year, Los Angeles had a big media kind of coverage where they were experimenting with reflective paving of surfaces. And so this just shows some street crews painting over those city streets with reflective paint. And so they're really excited about this. Some researchers that work on extreme heat with me, we kind of questioned it. And so they actually went out and tested the strategy. And they found that basically the idea is that the reflective paint reflects the light off of the street, so it's not absorbing it and releasing it at night, right? But where does it reflect the light off to and the heat off to? And so, as you all know, the sun doesn't travel exactly 90 degrees over Los Angeles or any city unless you're at the equator. So it reflects it at an angle and it hits either the pedestrians on the sidewalk or the buildings that are nearby it. And they found that for the pedestrians, it could increase heat as much as, I think, 18 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you can imagine 80 degrees in Los Angeles, you're walking on a sidewalk next to the street, and now it's 100 degrees for you. So obviously that's not a good solution. And they found that in the buildings nearby these reflective painted streets, the energy use kind of skyrocketed too, because all of that heat was now kind of going right onto the building and forcing them to use air conditioning. So again, this isn't to say that cities don't want to experiment, because we have to experiment, we have to test and evaluate these strategies. But this is one that we've kind of looked at, and at least in Los Angeles, it's not a really great option because it really decreases the thermal comfort of pedestrians and increases the energy use of buildings. So that's one that you may say that's a maladaptation, let's not do any more of that. So just some more considerations, again, from that literature review that we did. We need more exploration and research of heat planning processes and governance. And again, because there's no legal structure, because a lot of this is being experimented right now, it makes sense that we need to kind of see these experiments happen and document what's going on. And research and information being produced isn't always helpful. And so again, we're recommending that researchers like the folks you've heard from before, or even myself, actually work with the end users in something called co-production, where we work with the end users of the research and basically include them in the question making in the very beginning of the research project. And so we don't just ask questions that are interesting to us from a research angle, but we basically partner with the practitioners the whole way through to make sure that that research is as useful as possible. So we're not just kind of creating research that answers interesting questions for researchers, but isn't practical. And we found that that's particularly something that people doing extreme heat research need to look at. And then we had other questions too, like what's the most appropriate scale for extreme heat planning? Like I mentioned, the UHI at a regional scale is very different than site-specific planning. And I think we do a better job actually of site-specific planning, but we don't understand the regional implications of urban heat as well. And then just looking more at those institutional structures for collaboration, and then finding out those balances of the strategies between managing and increasing resilience to extreme heat. So I'll mention two more projects really quickly, and then we can get to Q&A. One I'll just mention is that Sara Meerow, who is another assistant professor up at ASU, and I are partnering, and we did a survey of planners across the United States last fall. And our survey was of 189 cities, and was basically asking them questions about the perceptions, the information sources, and the actions they were taking for extreme heat. And so we're analyzing those results right now. But the reason I mentioned this is it's the first survey that's been done of planners on extreme heat. And so some of the results are kind of interesting. And so I just have two slides that show some of our preliminary analysis, but from those planners in those 89 cities, we found that these were the strategies that they reported being implemented in those cities. And again, these cities were all across the United States, so not just the Southwest. But urban forestry was by far the most kind of popular method for dealing with extreme heat. And then emergency response, so that whole category of public health, kind of preparing and dealing with extreme heat, was the next strategy. And then man-made shade structures was the third one. And then weatherization of buildings was the fourth one. So I just kind of think it's interesting to see what planners think the most, what planners report is being implemented in their own city. And I'll just point out that the least popular implementation strategy was staff. And so one of the questions we asked was basically, do you have a staff member in your city that's designated to think about heat? And almost everyone said no. Like no one's the heat person. No one is dealing with this issue. No one's tasked with doing it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then just another one, this is the last from that survey, but we asked them what kind of information sources they use to think about extreme heat when they plan for it. And so it's a little bit grainy, but vegetation and tree maps was the most popular one. And again, that makes sense if they're thinking that urban forestry is the best way to deal with it. So again, and I would say that's not saying that is the best way to deal with it. That's just what planners' perceptions were, right? So they use vegetation and tree maps a lot. They use the National Weather Service's heat index quite a bit. And you can kind of see going down the line here, those land surface temperature maps are the UHI maps. And so basically what planners are saying is they don't really have access to those UHI maps very much. And the last one is future scenarios. And that basically is climate change information. So again, like I said in the beginning, we're not really using climate change projections very well to understand heat or to plan for heat in cities. So that was the least reported one that people talked about using. And then, like Karen mentioned, we have a current project going on this summer called Visioning a Cooler Tucson. And unfortunately, I don't have any graphics to show you guys because it's in process right now. But it is an interdisciplinary collaboration between myself, Jonathan Crisman, who's a humanities professor, and then Gregg Garfin, who sounds like you guys are familiar with and have worked with before. And so what we're doing is creating an educational tool specifically for K through 12 right now, although we'll expand it later on, that basically shows the trade-offs between those extreme heat interventions. And some of the interventions we're using are the ones that I covered before. So things like shade structures versus urban forestry versus green infrastructure. And to get this out into the community, we're partnering with the Recharge the Rain Project, which is a partnership of the University of Arizona's Water Resource Research Center and the Watershed Management Group. And they have several water harvesting gardens at schools across Tucson. And so basically, we're creating this tool for them to think through how those water harvesting gardens can also mitigate heat in the future. And so that's kind of our goal right now. And we'll have more updates at heat.arizona.edu. But we'd like to take what we learned from this project and, like Karen mentioned, make it more available to policymakers and decision makers too, just to kind of understand again those trade-offs between all of those interventions and the cost benefit between each of them. So just a couple of resources, and then I'll turn it over to Karen for questions and answers. So I was the science reviewer for the Urban Land Institute Scorched report that came out last year, and you can get this report for free at uli.org/extreme heat. And so it's geared towards, I would say, policymakers, mayors, urban planners, maybe real estate developers. So it's very built environments focused, but it does a nice job of covering some of the stuff I've covered throughout this presentation. And it's nice because you can download the PDF and it kind of has all of it in one single place. Like I mentioned, we also have the Extreme Heat Network that I run at the University of Arizona, and we've been running kind of bi-monthly webinars. And so those are all at heat.arizona.edu. So we've had speakers from New York City or other places kind of talk about what their communities are doing with extreme heat. And then we do have the paper that's under review right now that I'd be happy to share once the journal accepts it finally. So we just submitted it for minor revisions last week, actually, so it should be coming out shortly. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Karen, but certainly if there's any questions beyond what we covered today, you guys can reach out to me at ladd@arizona.edu. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
That was great. There's so much more to it than um, I understood, which is good to learn. What my first question would be, where are we with this? I mean, it seems like it's a huge mountain to climb across at least this country. What there's so many facets, and where are we in that regard?
Yeah, so I would say it's not just this country, but but I would say we are certainly in a worse position than other places due to kind of the federal administration and the forces at work. But I would say globally, we just don't understand a lot about heat compared to other climate risks, and so that certainly makes it more of a challenge, and it's a little bit makes it a little bit more terrifying than some other climate risks because you can see a hurricane coming on a map. We understand how to evacuate people. We don't do a good job of it, of course, if you look at Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria and other things that have happened. But heat is an invisible climate risk, is what we call it, because it happens and it kills people, and we don't even document it sometimes. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge. Is I don't even think that we're publicly aware yet of how much of a risk it's actually kind of facing us. And again, because it does impact vulnerable populations the most, um, it's just another kind of structural institutional thing where those that are most at risk for it are also the ones that are least able to talk to their government and get them to act on it. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, I'm going to open it up to, it's interesting because I find that really unusual that people, one, they aren't, the planners and et cetera, aren't tying in with climate change, and two, that they don't understand the impact of heat. But that, of course, is because we're here in where we live. We understand the impact of excessive heat. We have been noticing that for a decade here. So I'm going to open it up.
Sure.
Just you're on your honor system to take one at a time.
Uh, this is Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Um, I've seen several research papers over the past 12 to 15 years about the vulnerability of our electric power grid above
Mm-hmm.
ground out there in the open to extreme heat, and the danger of that during a heat wave when we rely on electricity to cool even our most affluent people,
Mm-hmm.
everybody. And so, what do you know about that research, and how valid is it, and what are we doing about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Barbara, you know as well as anybody because you're an expert in this as well. But I would say power companies are increasingly aware of kind of how they've set themselves up. And in one way, it's a good thing that we have regional power grids and regional cooperation that's centralized. But when it comes to things like the blackouts that we are facing, it's certainly not a good thing that it's so regionalized and kind of dealt with outside of the state level. Because when they do happen at the local level, that's where you experience it. And so again, it's always the vulnerable populations that are worse off because if a blackout happens, and if you have the money, you can go to a hotel or you can drive to a place that's cooler. If you're kind of trapped in your neighborhood and you don't have any other choice, you're trapped there. So I know TEP has done an increasing amount to understand the risk, and other power companies are too, but we need to do more, certainly. So.
Do we know what we can do about it? I mean, burying the power lines is one thing.
Yeah, I mean, decentralizing the power grid is basically the is basically the answer to it. And so
Okay.
decentralizing it and doing microgrids is what they call it. But there's a whole lot of state regulations and national regulations that aren't set up to allow power companies to be incentivized to go in that direction right now. So.
Susan has raised her hand. Susan?
Yeah, I have a question about solar panel structures create a lot of shade, and has there been any research done as to, to what extent a city would have to be covered with these shade structures, which create, electrical energy at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
to have some kind of measurable impact on the heat island effect?
Perfect question. And let me actually go back to our UHI map for that. And so that's one of those tricky things. That's one of those tricky trade-offs that we just have to think through. So let me go back all the way to that UHI map. So on this UHI map, if you had a number of those solar panels, which again do renewable energy, so that's a really good thing. if you had those if you had those solar panels showing up on this UHI map, they would actually show up as red because, again, this satellite data is going to show that it's kind of absorbing that heat and then releasing it at night, right? But the thermal comfort of the people underneath it is improved quite a lot. And so there might be things like those solar panels that would be really good for pedestrians and kind of the thermal comfort of people that live underneath them or walk underneath them, but they might actually increase the regional UHI. So that's one of those tricky trade-offs that we just have to think through. So some research has showed that large fields of solar panels can actually create a major UHI effect and kind of increase the temperature of surrounding areas. So it depends on the scale of it, and if it's kind of raised enough off the ground and has vegetation around it, it would probably have a smaller impact. And so I personally would say, from what I've seen, they're great in things like covering school playgrounds because they're doing, again, those co-benefits of shading the children and also generating power, where another man-made shade structure would just shade the children. So we can certainly think about those things, but I would say, like, if there's too many of them in one place and there's not enough vegetation or spacing around it, it could actually raise the regional UHI. So that's why heat is just such a complex thing. It just depends a lot on the site specific. So
I know some people have raised their hands, but I can't see them. So just jump in.
good question.
Shelley here. I've got a question. I've got two, actually. One is on transportation. If I look at the vehicle emissions plus the solar reflection from asphalt and other surfaces that support the infrastructure and its impact on local UHI. My second question is HVAC, HVAC. You mentioned that as part of your strategy. What I see now is there are multiple strategies. One, which includes circulation of outside air to mitigate the impact like of COVID. So my question is the city of Tucson going to end up with multiple HVAC strategies, or can they all be consolidated as one strategy that applies to you, your group, and other groups as well?
Yeah, good question. So I'll tackle the transportation one first. And so I think in general, transportation is probably one of the biggest causes of UHI, just because, again, it's not just the cars and the waste heat from the cars, but it's those giant parking lots and kind of all of the infrastructure that's created to support the car system. And so certainly reducing that wherever we can and replacing it with stuff that is less absorptive is going to help decrease our UHI. So that's a good point. For the second part, that's really tricky because I don't think the city of Tucson planning scales usually are 10, 20, 30 years out. By the time the city even starts to think about more efficient HVAC systems or the impact of coronavirus on it, the pandemic will be over in hopefully like 3 or 5 years, right? And so just the plan, that makes it a real challenging thing too, because a lot of the things we're talking about for the planning and design of the built environment, we really have to look at the long-term strategy. And it's taken 100 years for some of our cities to be built the wrong way that they are currently. And so it's going to take 20, 30, 40 years for us to get them kind of back on track, unfortunately. So I would say I did work with a group called the Global Heat Health Information Network, which is sponsored by the World Meteorological Organization and the World Health Organization. And we looked at that question about extreme heat and the coronavirus pandemic. And so I was the planning expert, kind of giving my planning perspective on that. And one of the sad things is that the things that you recommend people do for coronavirus, which is kind of physically distance and stay in your house, are the exact things that you wouldn't want people to do during a heat wave. And so, so in a lot of places in the world, those two kind of groups of advice conflict with each other for places that are dealing with the pandemic and heat waves. So I think we're a little bit better off in Tucson than a place like Bangladesh, but certainly even here, we've had to rethink kind of how we do cooling centers and stuff for the lower income populations. Good questions though.
Any questions?
I wanted to ask Lad, is there such a program in Tucson that assists low-income people with air conditioning units or some kind of protective, for extreme heat? Do
Yeah,
you know?
we do have, and so I'm not super familiar with Tucson, ironically, but we do have kind of home improvement, low assistance home improvement programs. They
Right.
aren't they aren't targeted at extreme heat though, although I think that's a connection we should do a better job of making more explicit for sure. So, but yeah, we have them, but I would say across all cities in the United States, they're always chronically underfunded and barely meet the actual need of what's out there. So, and again, I think a challenge with them too is a lot of them you have to be a homeowner to apply to,
Yeah.
versus most of the population that's in these types of situations are
Or
renters.
renters?
Yeah, and there's not a lot of incentive for the landlords to do these improvements. So
Slumlords.
The slumlords, you mean?
the slumlords, yes. Yeah, and that's why we look at those community spaces as being important. Although, of course, again with coronavirus and then just in general, if a heat wave comes, not everyone's going to go to a public library or go to a place for 5 degrees of cooling, or they might have to go back home because those cooling centers close, which is a big problem. A lot of them close during after business hours. And again, if the heat wave kind of raises those temperatures in the nighttime, that's actually when you're most vulnerable because that's when your body needs to rest and kind of recuperate. So,
Are there areas of Tucson, aside from downtown maybe, that are hotter, the UHI is higher, and they are areas where people are financially insecure? Do you have that kind of mapping?
absolutely. And so we have, so this is an older map, and we've created newer maps, but PAG, the PEMA Association of Governments, hasn't made them public yet or hasn't put them on their mapping layers. So PAG hosts a green infrastructure prioritization tool, and that's from 2008. So it is older, but it does have a UHI map layer on it. And then you can also look at things like the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, SVI map. And so a lot of cities will look at that urban heat island map and then overlay it on top of a social vulnerability map to kind of answer that question. And unfortunately, what we see in almost every city in the United States is that the lower income areas are always the hottest areas of the city. And again, there's many reasons for it, but the lower income populations, if it's more of a renter situation, they might not be putting that money into landscaping. And those higher income areas are usually the ones that can ask for more kind of beautification projects in urban forestry and have more of the political sway to get that kind of landscaping put in their areas. And so that's something that we see kind of across the whole country. And there's just a research paper last fall, I think, that came out that showed that historically redlined areas where the minority populations weren't allowed to move into are actually the worst, have the worst UHI in the whole country. And so that impact from redlining even decades ago is still showing up on UHI maps today.
Yeah.
This is
So
Peter.
I would say just for Tucson, to answer your question specifically, for Tucson, it's our south side, south of Davis-Monthan, that has the worst UHI map, the worst UHI. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let me go ahead if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
I'm with the Tucson 2030 district, and our water task force to meet the 2030 challenge goals, in addition to reducing potable water use, incorporated rainwater harvesting, stormwater management. And Tucson Water put together a mapping tool for the 2030 district, which shows the breakdown property by property of hardscape and greenscape within property. So we can take a look at that and see what can be done in order to reduce the hardscape, increase the greenscape or softscape, in part to capture rainwater and whatnot, but also it increases the vegetation. And I would like to, and this may be a longer range conversation we need to have separate from this one, but if there's a way that we could identify how that change in vegetation can affect local temperatures, that would also be desirable. I think if we could work on that, maybe what I need to do is just offline, Lad, I can send you some information about that, and we can have some additional conversation to see where it might go. But
Yeah.
I guess a question I would pose from that is, have you found ways of measuring what changes in natural vegetation in sites can do to change the temperature of the location?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say I'm not the expert on that particular part, although I'm involved in some projects that do. But you can do things like use a thermal camera basically, or IR camera, and kind of do a pre and post measurement where you measure the heat before you do the intervention and then measure it again after, and kind of
Okay.
see what that difference is. And so that's been really effective to show kind of the impact the green infrastructure, increased vegetation can have. And our colleagues up at ASU have a little cart that they pull around neighborhoods. And so last summer, some of my students helped them out because they were going through Savano actually, and pulling it through the kind of the new urbanist part of Savano that was
Mhm.
developed originally, and then the newer parts that are a little bit more suburban sprawly, and kind of showed the temperature differences between those two things. And so there's many different ways that you can do it, but that's something that's definitely doable. And I
Okay.
think and I think again it's super important that we evaluate those things and document them, because if you're not measuring these interventions and what you're doing, we don't know what the outcomes are. And so we might be actually increasing the temperatures if we're not careful. So
Okay.
yeah, so feel free to shoot me an email and we can talk
I
more
will
about
do
it
that. You
offline.
bet. Yeah.
Go ahead. I saw someone raising their hand, I think.
Lad, do you know, is there any tree maps available of our area?
Yeah, and so they're not of specific trees, although some places like San Diego have really comprehensive kind of tree maps that like literally show you the health of every individual tree. But again, the PAG, Team Association of Governments, and their green infrastructure prioritization tool. And if you guys want, I can send Karen the link to this because I've mentioned it a few times. That has an urban forestry map that's pretty useful. So
We sure would like to look at that, Karen.
Yeah, happy
Thank
to.
you.
yeah, and again, the only caveat is it's a little bit old, and so so it's better than nothing, but it is a little bit dated. So it is 10
Okay.
years old at this point. So
Well,
And
some of us are that way too, so we're used to that. That's okay.
A little bit old.
Yeah, a little bit old and dated. Yeah. Yeah.
real quick, I don't have everybody's email who's at this meeting. So my email is karen@climatetucson.com. So could you send me an email saying that you would like to receive those links? Anything.
Sure.
Just to,
yeah, and
Jog my
I'm making a
memory.
note so I can remember what I'm telling you. So
And I am going to put this, I'm recording this. It'll be online and I'll let people know that.
Great.
sure.
Any more questions? I thought for this, I just thought this was fascinating. There's so much information that I'm going to have to go through the slides again. There so many things that I had no idea were even part of the consideration, especially, and I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember exactly the wording, but not even being able to determine whether it's an emergency situation or a fact of life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just really strange.
Yeah, and I would just say maybe this is part of my closing remarks, but UHI and extreme heat are incredibly complex, and so I think it's no surprise that it's the climate risk that we're dealing with last. Probably because it's invisible, it's hard to model, it's hard to understand, it's hard to get facts on. So it kind of makes sense that we've been dealing with sea level rise and the more immediate ones first, and this is kind of the last one that we're really focusing on. And I would say you can absolutely get overwhelmed with all of the variables, and how every city has different climate and geography. But I think there are things that we understand very well how to do, and so increasing shade, no matter what type of shade it is, will always increase pedestrian or kind of the outdoor use comfort. And so kind of at the site specific scale, again, we're much better at designing sites for extreme heat versus than understanding kind of whole regions. And so I think there are a lot of things that we do in Tucson without even thinking of it as an extreme heat adaptation. And you can kind of look at all our older housing styles with the porch overhangs that we used to do.
Yeah.
Or Old Main on the University of Arizona campus has that, where the windows are protected. And so a lot of those things we should probably go back to, the traditional kind of architecture styles.
Yes.
And then I would say Tucson is really good now about doing those playground covers, and so the shade sails over all the playgrounds now. And so a lot of cities are looking at us and saying, oh, hey, that's a climate adaptation. But if you talk to the parks department, they're like, it's not a climate adaptation, we just do it because it's hot. And so it's kind of funny because you're like, well, it's hot because of climate change. It's getting hotter because of climate change.
Exactly.
But yeah, that's kind of one of the challenges too, is getting people in the Southwest to just recognize that some of the stuff we've always done is basically an adaptation that other people can look to and learn
That's
from.
true. I lived in West University neighborhood for a while in a 100-year-old house, and people were telling me what they had restored it really well, but there were signs of the old things that the house had to cool off, and it was really ingenious. And a lot of those houses, I don't know a lot, but a number of the houses in that neighborhood had basements. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and I would just say also that just again that we don't want to conclude that density is a bad thing, because density can actually help us decrease greenhouse gas emissions and can be a really good thing. And so we don't need to be as dense as in New York City to get a lot of those sustainability goals achieved. But even places like the University of Arizona is one of the cooler places in the city, actually. And it's because we do a good job of kind of mixing density with vegetation. And so I think places like that that are even 2 or 3 stories tall can be done really well and not increase the urban heat island effect, where places like Tucson Mall are the worst offenders because it's nothing but kind of large buildings and asphalt parking lots.
Right.
So density can be done well if we do it right. So.
Oh, fascinating. Well, any more questions? Anyone else have anything? Well, I'm gonna a round of applause for Ladd. It was a
Thank you, Ladd. Very good.
Yeah, really food for thought.
Thank you all.
For thought.
It's rare that I get such a friendly audience, so
Well,
it's kind of a treat.
well, one of my favorite things that, like I said, we started the Climate Tucson in October, and of course the guest speakers have been terrific. But the Q&A have been fascinating. People ask such wonderful, informed questions. I always enjoy the Q&A as well. So
Great.
thanks to the participants, and thank you, Ladd.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Okay, have a cool evening. Ha.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.